I'm Chad Reed.
I'm Hillary Langer.
I'm Gil Jenkins.
I'm Guy Van Sickle.
And this is Climate Positive.
For this week's episode, we're exploring the batteries as a service model and its transformative approach to scaling residential energy storage. I'm joined by Vinnie Campo, CEO and co-founder of Haven Energy, to discuss how the company is delivering affordable home backup power while helping utilities meet the challenges of rising demand. Vinnie, welcome to Climate Positive. Glad to have you on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Great to be on.
All right. To kick things off, could you tell us about Haven Energy's inception, its evolution, and bring us to where the company stands today?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we started Haven a little over 3 years ago, really to make affordable, reliable power accessible to all. And it's a very high level, mission of why we started the company. But I think as we looked at it 3 years ago, and this is more so true now, we saw this dramatic acceleration of renewables coming onto the grid. We all have always thought that the missing piece is the battery or energy storage. How do you solve the problem of intermittencies? And on the flip side, from a homeowner's point of view, and this is particularly true as someone who grew up in New Orleans, we see this increase in frequency of grid outages and like a strong need for backup power. And so we really started Haven around that core concept, which is every home at some point in the future should have a battery. Today, it's less than 1% of homes do have a battery. And what needs to be true to solve that and for that to happen? And so if you look at the evolution of the business, when we got started, we originally thought the main problem around battery storage adoption was the complexity of the process. And so we originally sought to streamline that end to end, bring the entire experience online, have a digitally native, very friendly, very modern experience. And so that was what I would consider version one of the business, which is deploying batteries, offering an exceptional customer experience. And it taught us how to install batteries. It taught us the market. It taught us the landscape. And we had this underlying thesis that once a customer got a battery installed, they would enroll that battery into a virtual power plant. And there's certainly been talks about VPPs or virtual power plants, the need for flexibility. But what we saw was that majority of homeowners that got a battery installed really wanted it for backup protection. And so the idea of enrolling to get some type of annual ongoing compensation, we didn't see that come to fruition as much as we had expected. And so we started looking at, all right, well, what actually needs to be true for every home to add a battery? And if you ask the average person, would you install a battery? They would say yes, but what's it cost? And that's really the problem with batteries or energy storage today, is that it's quite expensive. If you were to buy a battery system yourself, it would cost somewhere in the order of $15,000 to $20,000. It's a one-time purchase. It's quite expensive. And so you would have to have a real pain point around backup power to invest that amount in it. And many people do, and they do make that investment. We started seeking out what's the value of the battery to the grid? How do you actually unlock that value? And then how do you pass that back to the customer in the form of a lower cost? And so if you look at our business today, we offer backup power as a service. So we go to a homeowner and say, let us host a battery at your house, or in some cases, a solar and battery system at your house. When the grid's up and running, we're going to use that battery to help stabilize the grid. And when the grid goes down, you get that battery to provide backup power to your house. And instead of that being $15,000 to $20,000, that's going to be a very small monthly payment, just like you would pay for Netflix or any other type of monthly subscription. And so that's the evolution of the model. And that's where we've seen tremendous traction in the market, which is being able to take what is a really core thing that people need, which is reliable and affordable power, and to translate that into a very low or no cost system by coupling in the different types of ways you can value a battery in the energy markets. And that's where I think the industry is going, and that's why we're really excited to play in that space.
You definitely covered on a lot of the topics I wanted to talk about in that first section. Now let's turn to some of the factors affecting the market. California's NEM 3.0 rules significantly lowered the value of residential solar as a standalone investment, but can you talk about how that changed the market and the homeowner's equation for considering adding battery storage?
Well, if you take a step back and look at what that change is, and I know most people that listen will be familiar, but what NEM 3 did in California is it changed how much a solar homeowner gets paid for exporting their solar back to the grid. And there's certainly a tremendous amount of talk right now about, the need to expand the grid. How do we keep up with all of this demand from AI and data centers and reshoring US manufacturing? And all of that is correct. But when you really dig into the numbers, what we really need is more capacity and flexibility at the peak times of the year and not a tremendous amount of net new generation. And so what California was seeing, which I think is a canary in the coal mine for the rest of the country, is that they were seeing homeowners add solar. They were exporting their solar back to the grid in the middle of the day when there was already enough energy being produced and not enough energy being consumed. And so California said, let's shift how we actually compensate solar at the residential level. So let's make it more reflective of the real-time pricing markets, really to try and keep up with that. And what they've, I think, in effect done, which is certainly an intention of the policy, is that they've driven most homeowners in California to now install a battery when they actually install solar. So you've seen attach rates in solar in California go from sub 10% to 60 to 70% now of new solar installs include a battery, because it's really solving what the utilities and what the grid needs, which is being able to store that power from when it's produced in the middle of the day and to be able to shift it so that the home consumes it in the evening when people come home from work, when they start cooking, when they turn on their AC or their heating. So the ability to store that power from when it's not needed, shift it, and then use it when it is needed. That was really why they made that shift in California, but it's certainly reminiscent of what's happening across the industry, which is you have a lot of net new generation coming online. The grid is this like massively complex machine that's attempting to balance in real time supply and demand of energy that's produced and energy that's consumed. And it's why energy storage is like this amazing part of the equation, which is it's for the first time, and it's this balancing act that allows the grid to soak up the electrons from when they're produced but not needed and shift it to when they are needed.
And I want to talk about the AI and electrification crunch. We're seeing a rise in electricity demand that we haven't seen in generations, since World War II, from data centers and manufacturing, electrification. Utilities are facing many challenges in keeping up. How do you see them responding to these challenges? And can you talk also about the role VPPs are playing as it relates to battery backup?
I mean, if you look at AI, it's certainly one of the most transformative technologies that's come out in generations. The requirement for that is a massive build out of our electrical infrastructure to keep up with it. And when you look at what's happening across the country, you're starting to see retail electricity rates getting pushed up as a result of all this net new electric demand that's coming onto the grid. I think an interesting thing to keep an eye on in the next couple of years is this, trade-off or tension amongst building more data centers and then at what cost and the rising rate to to the end use customer. And I think utilities, I think they are certainly well aware of this, and they want to build out as much capacity as possible. And they want to be able to, in their territories, attract these large loads in these data centers as they are great customers for the utilities. I think the things that the utilities typically struggle with is that it takes a long time to build the scale required to meet the growing needs of these like very energy intensive, energy hungry data centers. And so what we see from utilities that they are responding, they are reacting, they are very quickly looking at what are the solutions. There is this gap in timing. It takes 3 to 5 years to build net new front of the meter generation. There's a documented backlog on turbines to build more natural gas plants. Nuclear, which is probably the most interesting, particularly like the small modular reactor nuclear facilities, that can be a great solve here is 10 years out. But you can't wait, right? Like the AI build out is happening so quickly and so rapidly that they need solutions today. And I think what's incredibly interesting is you're starting to see data centers look at, can they shorten the interconnection time or can they shorten the amount of infrastructure upgrade that's needed by actually either building batteries on site, like very large 50 to 100 megawatt batteries on site to reduce the amount of interconnection timeline that's needed? Or can they start aggregating different types of capacity to be able to offset their requirements? And for what it's worth, I do think utilities are really looking into this. And you see some of the more innovative utilities looking at, for the first time, either rate basing fleets of behind the meter assets or incentivizing through different structures more capacity build outs. And as we look at the market where we've seen the evolution, certainly where we as a business are evolving, utilities want as much capacity as quickly as possible. Behind the meter assets are by far the fastest way to do that. You can build a residential system in days versus years. And so where we see the big opportunity and what gets us really excited is, can you build, right now, tens and eventually hundreds of megawatts of behind the meter capacity, offer that directly to the utility as a very quick shortcut to be able to build out the grid requirements that they need. But more so than anything, the system itself is built out. We've invested trillions of dollars in building out the electrical grid to date. How do we maximize the system that's built versus having to rebuild, what I think is already a pretty good machine? And so where the utilities, where we see them going is, how do they maximize what they've built? How do they procure capacity? And that's across all behind the meter assets. Batteries to us are the most interesting, but certainly, smart thermostats, AC control, those programs have been around for a long time. I think now DERs are having their moment. This is the time to shine, but it requires a new model to come to fruition. And when we've talked to utilities before, what they were seeing is a large amount of solar and batteries coming onto the grid, but it doesn't actually benefit them. It's not in the right locations. The batteries actually aren't set up to be able to dispatch when they need. It's really at the customer's maximization versus the utilities. We seek to, how do you balance that out so both parties share in what is this tremendous build out of solar and storage, and how can the utilities get the capacity they need while homeowners also lower their electric bill and get the backup power that they need.
I'd love to talk about both sides of the coin here. I want to know, what's the most important ancillary service VPPs can offer to stabilize the grid, or where are utilities looking to use that resource most effectively? And on the other side of the coin, how have you seen customers' response to, my battery is going to be used by the utility, and how is that going to affect my use of the product?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if you think about it from the utilities point of view, there's two really interesting dynamics. One is that they're looking for capacity. And this is going to vary market to market. In Texas, which has much more of a real-time market, there are different ancillaries they're looking to procure, like a reg up, reg down, based on the nuances of that market. But if you look at PJM, CAISO, certainly like the Northeast markets, they're looking to procure capacity from batteries. And that is the solve that they're looking for. Where we think that, this takes a step further, and you're starting to see utilities like National Grid really take the lead here, is not just saying, all right, we need more capacity. They're saying, we need more capacity, but on these feeder lines or this substation at the micro level, where they would prefer to defer a grid upgrade and instead incentivize or procure capacity from local behind the meter resources. And I think that's a model that you'll see, certainly as you start to look out the next 3 to 5 years. It's not that we need batteries or capacity everywhere. They need it in very certain locations where there is congestion, where the substation is overloaded. And instead of taking 5 years to rebuild a substation, you can add 1,000 batteries in 2 or 3 months. And so from the utility standpoint, that is certainly the direction of travel that we see. They all want to get involved here. I think that there's a couple core pieces that need to start getting added. Like, they need visibility into the assets. They need to be able to, accurately forecast and then dispatch assets when needed. And then that gets to the other side of the equation you asked about, which is from the homeowner's point of view, right? Which is, hey, do I want to be sharing this back with the utility? Do I want to shift some of the revenue away back to the utility? And I think what we've seen, which we largely to be true, is that it all comes down to the price point. Again, there's going to be some customers that say, I don't want to do any of that. I want to spend maybe $20,000 for one battery or 30 or 40 for 2 or 3 batteries because I really have this acute problem around backup power and I just want to solve it. And I think that for those 3 to 5% of customers, that's the right answer. I think to reach the mass market and to really accelerate adoption, most customers would say, okay, I'm happy to take a much lower either upfront or a lower monthly payment. to have a solar and battery system, knowing that 10 to 20 times a year, my battery will be used to help stabilize the grid when needed. It all comes down to what that trade-off is to the customer. And what we've seen on VPPs, particularly in California, is that they're performance based. And so there's an unknown of how much a customer will get. And some years it'll be $500, and the next year it's $100. And so I think homeowners generally discredit or disvalue that. It's why we think capacity is the way forward, because it's a bilateral contract with the utility. We can capture that value and then feed that back into a guaranteed lower monthly price for the customer. And so they get that certainty of what the reduction is. It's on companies like Haven to then go execute and make sure those batteries perform. But that is certainly the way that the market's evolving. It's, I think, the natural way that the market needs to evolve to really be able to unlock the true value of distributed resources.
Let's pull the thread on that last comment a little bit. I know that your background as a trader has informed your strategy. How does Haven capitalize on regulatory volatility, short-term market changes, incentive windows, price spikes to build that long-term sustainable capacity?
I mean, the way that we think about our business, we got started, there's a program in California that's been around for a decade called the Self-Generation Incentive Program. And it's really meant to drive more storage onto the grid. And it's an incentive payment for homeowners that install storage. Incentive structures like this are really interesting. And, to the point around arbitrage, they are arbitrage opportunities that aren't around forever. We have always viewed incentives as the wedge to be able to come in, to be able to prove that batteries can be useful to the utilities, that they can fill capacity requirements, and then to translate that into a longer term contract. And so as we've always thought about it, when you look more broadly across the US, not just California, Duke Energy in North Carolina had a very large battery program. Illinois has just adopted a battery incentive program. Those are good at seeding the market and getting all the market players focused on how do we drive more battery storage adoption. But those incentives are typically time bound, whether it's 3 to 5 to 10 years. Industry needs to adopt and adjust so that you do move into the more capacity or energy markets that utilities really need. And so that's always been our view, which is let's start there. Let's build out a differentiated product there. Then let's figure out how do you actually dispatch the batteries the right way. We're now dispatching thousands of batteries at a time. So you start to be able to actually dispatch 10, 20, 30 megawatts of capacity back to the utility. And that's starting to offset peaker plants from coming online. And so that is, certainly as you think about the arbitrage, it's how do you start with what's available? How do you bundle it into a way that's very simple for the homeowner? Like the homeowner doesn't want to deal with the 50 steps required to capture an incentive. They want you as a developer to do it all and handle it all end to end. And that's the value that we provide is we go to the homeowner and say, here's your very low monthly price. It's by far the lowest cost way to get storage is by coming to Haven. And then we handle everything else on the back end. And so that focus on the simple customer experience, that's really the key to being able to drive adoption.
That makes sense. I want to talk about how Haven has navigated this rapidly changing regulatory landscape. And are you seeing any trends now or potential market opportunities in your current or prospective markets?
I think the big one to call out, certainly the OBBB, that certainly changed the landscape of how the tax credits, which have always been a part of the renewable energy industry, fundamentally changed how that works. So starting at the end of this year, or if I take a step back, it used to be that regardless if a homeowner owned the system or if a third-party owner like Haven owned the system, each party was able to get a 30% tax credit for installing that system. We have long thought that DER should be owned by third-party developers so they can actually provide that capacity back to the grid. And so we had shifted our model 12 months ago. So instead of selling systems directly to homeowners, in all cases, Haven owns and operates the systems that we install. So think of it as like you pay a low monthly price and you get the system, like a very easy model for the consumer. But the change that's happening at the end of this year, that's I think the show has covered well, is that tax credit for the homeowner, if a homeowner owns a system, that's going away at the end of this year. And so the major shift that's coming to our industry is that to date, 60 to 70% of systems are homeowner owned. And starting January 1st, that's going to completely invert to probably 70 to 80% being developer owned. And so that is a major change for the industry. We feel very fortunate that we had made that change in our model 12 months ago, to not knowing that change was going to happen, but just because we believe that was the right way that DER should get deployed. But I do think there's going to be many knock-on effects for developers, local installers, and certainly homeowners of where that ownership lies of the system. And that is the major shift that's coming, that's going to shift it back to being developer-owned systems.
And drilling down into that, as Haven considers expanding its reach, what regulatory environments or utility procurement setups indicate that a state is equipped to support the battery as a service model?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the way that we typically evaluate it is there needs to be a homeowner need. So like states that have rapidly rising electric rates and frequent grid outages, those are prime candidates for distributed resources like solar and batteries. And then on the flip side, the markets need to be open where there's a way to aggregate and sell behind the meter capacity directly to the utilities. And so those are the two lenses or the two frameworks that we look at. What's so interesting about the US is that the markets are so different at the state by state level. California is, I'd say, quasi deregulated. You still have the three major utilities, but underneath that, they have a deregulation framework where local cities can create their own community choice aggregators. So you have this partially deregulated model. You have Texas, which is the extreme end, which is a fully deregulated model where anyone can go become a retail electric provider. You can secure generation and offer electric services to customers. And then you have fully regulated markets where the utility or the investor-owned utility owns both the generation, the distribution, and the end customer delivery. We're really interested in that partially deregulated model. Like the California market, it's where we started. There is rapidly rising electric rates in California, up 30% in the past 3 years alone, very frequent grid outages. And they have what I'd say is one of the more forward-thinking frameworks around how do you source behind the meter assets. So California is a really attractive market. When you start to look outside of that, a lot of the states in the Northeast, they have similar dynamics and characteristics. They have some of the oldest grid infrastructure in the nation. Due to storms, they do have frequent outages. And particularly in the PJM markets where a lot of data centers are getting built, you're seeing the cost of both energy and capacity rising at a pretty alarming rate. And so those markets typically attract, whether it's behind the meter or a larger front of the meter, attract a lot of storage solutions. So there's both a market need from a homeowner's point of view and from the utility or the grid's point of view.
Now let's talk about the scaling and operation strategy. Haven is venture-backed, but it deploys physical hardware. What's the most important operational lesson you've learned from scaling high-growth companies to create a successful turnkey development model in such a capital-intensive and regulated market?
Yeah, it's interesting. My background, I started my career as an energy trader. I went and spent a number of years at Uber as Uber was scaling up. And then I came back to the energy space and was running a deregulated retail electric provider in Texas. So each of those experiences were very different. I think certainly my time at Uber, I've come to appreciate what hypergrowth looks like, of how do you, scale a double-sided marketplace and to do so efficiently or effectively. The way that we have always thought about it is, you mentioned that we're venture-backed. I've raised multiple rounds of venture capital to support the growth of the business. It is also, we're building an infrastructure business because we own and operate the assets. And that is a different type of capital to raise and deploy as well, too. I think what we have always seen, though, is, it always comes down to the product. Like, what is the product that you offer to the homeowner? What is the product that you offer to the utility? And why is it that they're doing that? For the homeowner, it's simplicity, it's peace of mind, and it's cost. So if you can solve those for the homeowner, you certainly have a winning proposition. And for the utility, again, it's simplicity and cost. Like, they want to procure as much capacity as they can, as quickly as they can. And that is what Haven provides to both sides of those parties. So as we've thought about it, we've said, how do you build what is by far the lowest cost backup power to the homeowner? How do you make the process, most people wouldn't describe getting solar batteries installed as a magical experience. And we're maniacally focused on how do you make that entire process end to end a magical experience and very delightful for the customer. And I think you see that reflective in our NPS scores and our external ratings, is that we have always put that customer at the forefront of everything that we do. And we think that's the way, that is the right way to scale the business, which is keep your customer in mind. You have a maniacal focus on providing an exceptional experience. And you wake up every day saying, how can I make this experience a little bit better every day? And then you have these compounding advantages over time of you built this really turnkey end-to-end solution that is differentiated, unique, and that customers really love.
Now, let's look forward to 2035. You mentioned in the past that you want Haven to be the largest decentralized power producer. What will be the most noticeable practical change an average homeowner in their daily life once that decentralized grid becomes a reality?
We had run a study right when we started this business just to understand how consumers think about their energy companies. We wake up every day thinking about energy, about deploying hardware, about the customer experience. But it turns out that's not the case for everyone, right? Like the average homeowner spends 7 minutes a year thinking about their energy provider. And it's usually when they receive a high bill, typically in the summer or the winter. And so the unlock there is that if you ask every homeowner what they want, they want to pay less and they want it to be more reliable. And I think for the majority of folks, that's it. They want to think about the different optimizations, how to make it work. We think the best way that you accomplish that is by installing hardware, optimizing with software, and then taking every guesswork or part of that equation away from the homeowner. So, what we do and certainly what it looks like in 2035, every home has a battery. That battery is intelligently charging and discharging based on different pricing signals from the market. It knows when the homeowner is, it's learned from the homeowner their patterns of when they come home. It starts to discharge or pre-cool the home. It charges up overnight based on their different patterns and the different signals from the grid. And it is this very intelligent, effectively brain and energy operating system for the home that does all of the dirty work and the guesswork for the homeowner so that they get a lower bill, they get an optimized rates, and their power stays on if the grid ever goes down. So today, we're installing hundreds of batteries a month. By next year, that'll certainly scale. And by 2035, that's tens of thousands of batteries a month that we're deploying nationwide, not just in the California market.
All right. Now, we're at the end here. And one of the things that we do on Climate Positive is we ask our guests to sit in the hot seat and we rifle off a handful of more personal questions, a little off topic, just to have a little fun. Are you ready?
Let's go for it.
What's one thing your colleagues might not know about you?
I think most people know I'm from Louisiana. I'm born and raised in New Orleans. I have deep roots down there. What I don't think they know is that I'm an exceptional. In Louisiana, we have a lot of Cajun food, but crawfish is really the bread and butter. And one thing I pride myself on is, I have the crawfish pots. I've got the full setup, and I can do a pretty good Louisiana style crawfish boil. I live in Austin, so you don't see a lot of that here. And so I think a lot of folks are surprised when you bust out the full framework and can put together a pretty good crawfish boil.
That sounds amazing. What's the best advice you've ever received?
That's a tough one. I've been incredibly fortunate over my career to have just amazing mentors at each step of my career that in each different facet have taught me different things. I think certainly in this phase of building a business and scaling it, that one of the best advice I've always gotten is just to keep it simple. I think a lot of times in a startup, you can look to try and do too many things, and that is typically the downfall of the business. And so just keeping it incredibly simple, keeping it incredibly focused on the mission. How do you make affordable, reliable power accessible to all? And then drive the team towards that mission. And everything that we do should be simple and revolved around solving that pain point for our customers. And I would say that, keep it simple.
What's your favorite productivity hack or daily ritual?
I don't do it as much as I would like anymore. I now have 3 kids, and our youngest is 6 months. And so that has certainly thrown some wrenches into it. But for me, I always try and get up early. I go to the gym. It's like my time to, start the day, with some time at the gym. And then I typically spend a little bit of quiet time there before everyone wakes up, prioritizing the day, starting to communicate with our team members and really starting to plan things out. But getting up early, getting the most important things of the day done, doing it when it's quiet before all the different parts of the day start to arrive. I try and do that. And then I have breakfast with my kids before they go to school. And then I'm back online for, the real start of the day.
I can definitely appreciate that. And what's one skill you'd love to learn outside work?
I'll say I have 3 kids. They're 3 boys. They're all under the age of 5. They love being out on the water. They're like really starting to love fishing. I'm a competent but not excellent fisherman, but would love to really refine and hone the craft there, and just something to share with my kids as they grow up as well too.
Appreciate that. All right, finally, as we ask all our guests to fill in the blank, to me, climate positive means building the future. I think there's never been a greater time to build a distributed capacity company. I don't think there's ever been a more urgent need to solve how do you rebuild electrification in this country. And I think it's an honor to be able to work on that problem every single day with amazing coworkers who are, fully bought into this mission of how do you revolutionize the grid? How do you build what we think is the next great distributed energy company? And yeah, I feel really fortunate to be able to do that with amazing people. And yeah, I feel really lucky to build and solve what I think is the most pressing problems we face today. Vinnie, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much. This has been great. I appreciate you having me on.
If you enjoyed this week's podcast, please leave us a rating and review on Apple and Spotify. It really helps us reach more listeners. You can also email us at climatepositive@hasi.com to let us know what you thought. I'm Kenny Gayles, and this is Climate Positive.